Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast.
BJ, what's up, dude? Your last episode was awesome, man. I loved hearing you talking about how because you felt more comfortable making a Pathfinder 2 character, you were having a lot of fun making the character. I hear that 100%. I've never gotten to play in a game where I play two separate characters, but I think I'd probably really like it because I love making characters, man. And your half elf dex based cleric ranger sounds awesome, dude. That's man, good call. And yeah, for sure, Pathfinder 2 absolutely holds a soft spot, a special place in my heart. It's given me so much over the years. I mean, I probably wouldn't even be on Anchor if it wasn't for Pathfinder 2. And now there's a whole bunch of people that just got a new reason to hate Pathfinder 2. Anyway, man, peace out.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's good to hear from you. Yeah, I had a lot of fun making characters. I love making characters. I'll talk about a little bit that here in the end of my first segment, because we are talking about character building a little bit today. Although I'm going to talk more about backstory as opposed to building the class and the feats and all the bells and whistles. But yeah, I really do enjoy character building. It's a lot of fun to see what kind of characters you can come up with. Even just I think there's a little sub hobby within the hobby of people just building characters in their spare time when they have a chance, and a little free time on their hands. So yeah, thanks for the compliments. I still am looking forward to the day you and I can get together and play. Well, anything really. Although I'd really enjoy. I think I'd really enjoy playing in any of your Pathfinder games. I don't know how you'd find me as a DM. Carl seems to tolerate me pretty well, so I got that going for me in terms of recommendation, and none of my other players have run away screaming. So hopefully it'll happen sooner than later. But yeah, thanks again for the call, everybody. That was Joe Richter of the Hindsightless podcast. Please be sure and check out. You can find his podcast here on Anchor or on most podcatchers. And he talks about Pathfinder 2 being the reason he's even in podcasting. He has a podcast that he isn't doing anymore, but way back when Pathfinder 2 he first started, he and some of his friends did the Wheel or Woe podcast where they recorded their Pathfinder 2 campaign, and it's still out there to enjoy. So go take a listen. So now I'm going to turn to my first segment here, which is about a little bit about character building, but it's more about some thoughts I have on character backgrounds. I want to talk a little bit about character backstories, but I'm going to start at it from kind of an odd angle. So just bear with me for a few minutes. One of the design goals that you see in fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, and it actually started in fourth edition. It kind of came late in fourth edition, but that they carried forward into fifth edition was the idea of having people with different complexities for their characters to be able to play at the same table. So if I want to play a straight up fighter, which is embodied in the champion archetype for the fighter class, there are not a whole lot of decisions to be made. It's just sort of a generic standard fighter that just kind of you level up and you get your abilities, and it's really simple. It's a perfect choice for someone who has never played Dungeons and Dragons if they're going to dive in, particularly with fifth edition. There's not a lot of fiddly bits. It's very straightforward, and if you play the champion fighter, you're mostly going to be learning the core mechanics of D&D that apply to whatever class you're playing. And so that was the design goal for the champion. If you look by contrast to the battle master archetype for the fighter, where you get to pick and choose an array of maneuvers, much the way a spellcaster might choose their spells. So you get maneuvers that you can use in combat, and you can pick different subsets of them to kind of build different types of fighters with the battle master. But player one can play a battle master and player two can play a champion, and they work perfectly well at the same table in the same party on the same adventures. And so the idea was not to force someone who just wanted a simple kind of fighter to play to have to deal with complexity that they didn't really care about, versus someone who really finds building and customizing their character um, finds that very interesting, and to not deny them that option. And I think that at least with the first round of class options in the player's handbook, that was the idea, that there would be, you know, multiple choices that you could get for the archetype or the theme of your character. But within each class, I wanted to give one basic one that was the most easy to run for people who didn't want to get into a lot of theory crafting and system mastery and things like that. So that was the idea with class functions in D&D, and Mike Merles and Jeremy Crawford made that very apparent in their kind of discussions during the play test, and when the 5th edition first came out and the final products, again reiterated that that was sort of the goal, with having different archetypes. Some are more complex than others within each class, and the fighter provides a very, very good example of that. So what does that have to do with backstories? Well, you've got some players who all they really want to do is pick a name and alignment, um, and they have some vague notion of their character's personality, and that's all they want to put into their character. That doesn't make them a bad player. Um, that may just be where they start out with the character, and they may grow into the person's the character's personality over time, and then flesh them out a little bit, as well as maybe fleshing out some ideas of the backstory. But that's really all they want to get in. They just want to play. They don't want to make a lot of choices. You've got other people who can't really sink their teeth into the character they've created unless they create a more detailed backstory. And we've all heard the horror stories of DMs who somebody hands them a 12-page backstory and expects them to read all this, and also supposedly, I've never actually encountered this, they want all that incorporated into the way the DM sets up their campaign. So the DM now has to make their own choices about encounters and the sequence of events and what's going on in the world based on this person's backstory. And you've got variations in between. Again, I don't know if that really happens, but you hear about it a lot in D&D, online anyway, about that extreme example of a huge backstory that the player really wants the DM to know. I know people who will write a lengthy backstory in their head. They don't expect the DM to do much with it, though. They just need it to. That's what they need in order to get into the headspace to play their character, and that's okay. And I guess what I'm getting at here is it possible to run a campaign that allows for all of that? I mean, a group has to be cohesive. They have to get along. They have to play well together to play in a role-playing game. But do they all have to have the same play style and the exact same expectations? I mean, I guess if they're too disparate and too far removed from one another, then maybe they're just not compatible. But generally speaking, most people who enjoy the game can settle into a balance. And it's important for I think, a DM to know, and I'm not the first one to suggest this, to know what motivates each of your players, so that you're given a little bit of what they enjoy pretty regularly throughout the game. So if you got someone who really enjoys tactical combat, make sure you put some tactical combat in. If you got someone who really enjoys role-playing scenes with NPCs, put that in there. But if you got both of those people in the party, you need to balance those two things so that one doesn't overshadow the other. And also so that whatever motivates and drives all the other players at the table, they get their chance to be a part of that. And that's when I think of backstories, I think of the same thing. Is some people are going to want a complex backstory. Some people are going to want a simple backstory, and there'll be people who are somewhere in between. And it may be a good idea as a game master to know where your players stand on that. Don't twist someone's arm to give you a complicated backstory if that's not really what they're interested in. If they're cool, just kind of making kind of a vague backstory and getting into the game and just interacting with the environment you present for them, that's really that's fine. And then if you got someone who really wants to have that more grounded, fleshed out history for their character, that's fine as well. But again, you want to kind of balance or weave together the way you run the game so that they're getting what they want from those backstories within reason. Um, as a player, I think it's important to remember that as well. That the person sitting to the table next to you at the table isn't doing it wrong if they have a far more detailed backstory than you prefer, or if they have a far more simpler backstory than you. Just let them run their character, manage their character, and along the way, everybody's going to fall in and find their role and their niche and the kind of thing they bring to the table, and so that's fine. But I think a lot of people, a lot of old school players, will sometimes get a little crotchety about, particularly younger, not just either younger players or maybe even players our own age who have only recently come into the hobby, where it's more normal to have these big detailed backstories, and we might get a little cranky about that. And I think we deserve to cut the new guys some slack if that's what they need to role play. But also, it's important if you're a newer player and that's kind of been your experience to understand there are lots of people who don't play that way, and even newer players that don't want to, that maybe aren't interested in playing that way. So, you know, we're not all. You think something like Critical Role, which they talk about the Critical Role effect, the Matt Mercer effect. I don't believe it's that really big of a deal. I think it certainly inspired a lot of people to take up the hobby, and it has influenced, I think, probably younger players a little more. That they do. My experience has been younger players who've been exposed to watching live play, particularly with produced shows like Critical Role and some of the other ones that you can find on YouTube that have a lot of professional content creators. They are a little more prone to ham it up and speak in first person when we're in role playing situations, and that's fine. That's wonderful. Not everybody plays like that, particularly people who may be a little more introverted. Um, but I bring up Critical Role to say that I don't. They're all professional actors, professional storytellers. Of course, they're going to flesh out those characters and give them detailed backstories that they may not share them up front, but they'll be doled out and revealed over the course of the campaign. And they create, strong, eccentric, interesting personalities and mannerisms and voices for their characters. But they're professional entertainers, so I don't think we have to do that as sort of just hobbyists at our own game tables. So I don't think we need to be expecting that. I don't think DMs should expect that players shouldn't expect to bring that to the table, and that every DM is going to make time for that. Again, it's another good thing to have session zero and frequent check-ins if you're with a group of players who are kind of relatively new to playing with each other and may have varying expectations going in, particularly when it comes to backstory, character development, character arcs, and the kind of things that will grow out of a backstory. You know, there's no right way or wrong way of doing that. It's just whatever suits your table and the interests of the people playing the game at any given time. Uh, so for me personally, I tend to not do a lot of detailed backstory unless someone asks it for me. I tend to think more maybe the person's personality, what they're like to interact with as a character, and more their personality traits and their core motivations and things like that. But maybe that's because I'm a psychologist and that's the first place I am. Of course, I know good and well that in our own lives, those things are all heavily influenced by our backstories. But for my characters, I tend to focus on what it's going to be like to watch if you were going to watch that character go through a scene or an encounter. What's everybody else going to see, and then the backstory I can fill in details later as needed. Um, but I like to get my head just my head around the person's thoughts and their feelings and their motivations, and then I can create a little bit of a backstory just to kind of get myself going, and then flesh it out later depending on what the campaign is like. And again, as a player, I'm a kind of player who more wants to play the world. I don't want to create. I mean, I'll sit there and create characters when I'm bored and think I'll play this sometime. Um, but in the end, when I get a chance to play in a campaign, usually I want to know what the campaign setting is, where we are, what world we're in, what it's like, what the culture is like, and what's going on, because I want to create a character that is suited for the campaign and suited for the campaign world. I want to play the world. I don't want to create a character in a vacuum and then try to shoehorn it into someone else's space, whether it's the DM or even to maybe inadvertently create a character that isn't suited for the party. I also kind of like to know what everybody else is playing when I create a character, so that I can create something that'll be fun for me to play, easy on the DM, and also will work well with everybody else's characters. So we can all, again, it's a group activity. D&D is a team sport. So those are my thoughts on backstory. It can be complex. It can be simple. We need to make space for people who want complex and simple stories to be able to play together, as long as their play styles are otherwise compatible. And again, as always, it's just something that everybody needs to talk about whenever you're starting a campaign. I'm talking in terms of D&D mostly, because that's mostly what I play. But of course, this is any kind of role-playing game during character creation. So anyway, I would love to hear responses, what people think about this, what their preferences are for backstories, how they create backstories, what DMs think of how they use players' backstories, and what kind of guidance they give players. Yeah, give me some calls out there. I expect maybe we'll hear from some of the usual callers, but if there's anybody out there who's never called in before, I'd love to hear some new voices. You can also email me, arcane.alienist@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to just read your message and give a response on an upcoming episode. So that's it for backstories. This is a little long overdue. I want to do a review of Carcass Crawler issue number 2. This is Carcass Crawler is the official zine of Old School Essentials. It presents some optional rules for use with Old School Essentials. I recall that Old School Essentials in its pure form, the core rulebook is really just Mold Bay and Cook's old BX D&D. They just it's just those very same rules. But we have the advance, which gives us some options to make it a little more like first edition AD&D. Not mechanically, but at least in terms of your character options and the monsters and spells available. And the Carcass Crawler tends to present you with options that you could use either with Classic or with Advanced. And so this is the second issue. So let's dive in and look at what we got here. It's got a nice, looks like a giant, some kind of colossus, some kind of giant construct on the front, kind of walking walking up out of the ocean with some people, somebody running away in terror. So it kind of looks maybe inspired by the Colossus of Rhodes. It looks a little bit like a storm giant, but it also looks like it's made out of either stone or iron. Maybe it's an iron golem. Anyway, what do we got here in this issue? We've got 2 new types of elves, and these are presented as classes if you want to do the classic BX, and then they're presented as race options if you're using the advanced option to do separate race from class. The first one is a phase elf, and this harkens back what Gavin Norman says in here is it's partially harkens back to the old idea from original D&D where an elf was both a fighter and a magic user, but they picked at the beginning of every adventure what they were going to be. And so they just switched between classes rather than having this sort of blended elf class that you see in BX. And it wasn't really. I've looked through the old rules. It's not always clear exactly whether that was supposed to be a multi-class or whether you divided the experience or whether you just, based on the XP amount you've got, you're this level fighter or this level magic user, and it just your level is defined by that one pool of XP and just what you're going to be that day. Anyway, that's what we get here. We get an elf who can choose whether they're going to be more of a warrior or a magic user for the time being. So their prime requisites, minimum intelligence of 9, prime requisites are intelligence and strength, hit die 1d6, maximum level 10. They're proficient in all armor and weapons. And so it looks very much like the if you look at the experience table, very much like the elf class that you're used to in BX. And with the spell progression, but it notes that's when they're in the magic user phase. Here's sort of this also though seems to tap into the modern version of the Illidan from 5th edition D&D that kind of chooses a phase to be in, and then maybe takes on a little bit of different sorts of powers and a different demeanor. In fact, this notes that one of the traits of the phase elf is a dual persona. They have two independent but interconnected personae or phases: their fighter phase and their magic user phase. Of course, 5e Illidan, they go through the seasons. They have a winter phase, a summer phase, a autumn phase, and a spring phase. But each morning upon waking, the character can choose to switch their other phase. This is called phasing. Phasing is possible at most once per day. And their abilities are going to be dependent on which class they're using. When in the fighter phase, the character's eyes are pure white, and the magic user phase, their eyes are pure black. The two phases have knowledge of one another, but they're different personalities. They can even have different alignments. They share the same name, but their personalities and goals may differ. That's a really cool idea. Harkening back to the Cerebrivore episode we did on mental health, I would once again say this is getting into something similar to maybe a real world types of dissociative identity disorder or personality disorders. If you're going to play this character, just please do it respectfully with I would treat it as a completely fantastic phenomenon, and not try to pin it on any attempt to create a character that has multiple personality disorder or anything like that. Um, they're immune to ghoul paralysis, have infravision, listening at doors. So pretty much otherwise like the elf class. So we get the phase elf, but then we get, with respect to old school advanced, the option of having a phase elf as a race and not a class. So it would choose their classes. And so again, it would have the standard elf abilities by race: the immunity to ghoul paralysis, infravision, listening at doors, bonus. Here, the dual persona, the elf has two independent but interconnected persona, again described as phases, and they must select two classes. And because when you go the advanced option, elves are capable of choosing from several different classes, you would just pick the two classes. Upon each morning awakening, they again choose their class, the class or their phase. And they use, because they don't have a unified class table, they use the THAC0 and saves for the current phase class that they're in. Their class abilities do that. They have a single pool of hit points shared by both phases, and you would treat it like you often do with multi-classing, where you roll the hit dice and they get half the value. Experience points are tracked separately. So this is basically a multi-classed elf. It's just they can only make use of one class at a time. And again, it notes their eyes change color, and they're two interconnected but distinct personalities that might have different goals, or might even have different alignments. The second elf they put in is a wood elf, and this is a lot simpler. This is basically very much like the classic elf class, except they get druid spells instead of magic user spells. They also require a little bit higher XP. Am I reading that right? Are they requiring the XP is different? I'm sorry, I'm looking at these wrong. The phase elf actually. Let me grab my old school. I'm looking at Carcass Crawler. Let me grab my old school essentials to make sure I'm looking at this correctly. The dwarf. Where's my elf? So both of these types of elves presented here, if you're going to use them as the class, they have much lower XP thresholds. I think the phase elf, because it's really not using the benefit of both classes at the same time, so it's on the 2500 for second level character advancement, which I think is much more like a magic user in terms of the amount of XP you need to level up. And then the wood elf is a little more. It's 3,000 for second, 6,000 for third, 12,000 for fourth. So it's on a 3,000 XP advancement, which is much lower than, a little bit lower than the arcane magic using elf. But they're making use of druid spells. So to use this, you would need to use the advanced, at least the druid spell list from the Oh, I'm sorry, not druid spell, the divine magic. So they're using the cleric spell list. I would probably rule, given that it's a wood elf, if somebody wanted to play this, I'd probably let them choose the druid spell list if I was using old school advanced. Um, and let them pick. So this, if you just use the straight up cleric spells, you've kind of got almost a wood elf kind of paladin. Um, you know what? I'm stumbling over my words again. It is the druid. It says divine magic in one in one paragraph, but when you read down, it tells you where to look for their spell list. It is giving you, referencing you to old school essentials advanced fantasy to get the druids, and then it says if you're not going to use that, use the cleric list instead. Um, but not let them have cure light wounds until second level. Well, interesting, because they get a spell at first level as wood elf class. Otherwise, it's what you would expect with some of the stuff from immunity, ghoul paralysis, again, improvision, listening at doors. But wood elves also get a missile attack bonus, +1 attack with missile weapons. They have an uncanny ability to disappear from sight in the woods and undergrowth. They can hide with 90% chance of success, and they have an awareness. They're only surprised on a roll of 1. That might mean the wood elf is able to act in a surprise round when the rest of the party cannot. Again, you get a strict race version of this if you're going to go full old school essentials advanced. It maintains the detect secret doors, immunity to ghoul paralysis, and improvision you would expect of elves, but it pulls in, as I mentioned before, the missile attack bonus. I suspect they don't get the stealth options as a race that they would as a class, because they can choose, assassin, ranger, and thief as a class, which would give them those abilities by class rather than by just being a wood elf. So those are pretty cool. I particularly, I don't know if I'm a big fan of the phase elf, but I do like the wood elf. But if a player really saw this and wanted to play the phase elf, I'd let them do it. It's their character, not mine. I don't think it would ruin a campaign. But if I was going to create a curated list of what you could do, I would gladly put the wood elf in there, and maybe be more hesitant about the phase elf. We have town services. This is a really useful expansion, and this is really just a list of default costs for food, drink, and lodging, and other types of in services. Not in service, other types of services you'd get at an inn, such as a bath and personal services like having your clothes laundered, or having a barber give you a trim, private dining room, stabling and fodder once they get your characters have mounts. The other thing that is really cool in here is they talk about the role of jewelers, money changers, and provisioners in towns, and what kind of services they offer. Jewelers are useful for buying and selling gems and jewelry, and for appraising treasure. Money changers will exchange one kind of coin for another for a fee, and also, they serve as a kind of banker where you can put a bunch of money with them, and if, as long as you leave it with them for at least a month, they won't charge you a fee. If you try to withdraw it early, there's a fee. And they might create loans. It says unknown low-level characters can get a loan of up to 5 gold pieces with a deposit of a valuable item. For larger loans, the item value will increase, and there's a 10% withdrawal. 10%. The fee is 10% of the value of the loan per month. Well-known and respected characters might be able to get a better rate. And traders and provisioners can trade in common tools and trade goods. So you can buy and sell equipment there. And they also have a little sidebar on guards and wards, and talking about the types of guards in terms of actually armed guards, security guards, traps, locks, and the things they'll use to protect the money and the jewels that they have, that they keep in their workplace, just in case a thief decides that they'd like to engage in a little bit of burglary. And then there's an optional rule for haggling when dealing with any of these professions. It's got a roll on a 2d6 Well, not so much for the money changers, but for the jewelers and traders, there's a way of rolling a 2d6 and modifying it by charisma the same way you would a reaction modifier, and it tells you how they might adjust, a jeweler or a trader might adjust an item's price. There's a section that's a little more hiring retainers. It's got some suggestions on locating potential retainers, like frequently drinking establishments, posts on help wanted boards, um, and ways to import those into the game. Where you might be able to find, like the number of people you could find in a village, a small town, a large town, or a city. If you're looking for just townsfolk that you might want to hire as a porter or a torchbearer, or a cook or something like that, versus adventurers that are actually going to have a class. And of course, the larger the settlement you get into, the more that you might be able to find. Townsfolk are, of course, zero level humans. Adventurers are treated as retainers. You can roll for random, or if you don't want to insert a certain specific type of retainer, you can just roll randomly to see who's available. Um, and it's kind of cool. You roll a d12, and it's got the basic classes you would find in Old School Essentials, and then alternatives drawn from uh, Old School Advanced. Uh, Wages, some suggestions on what kind of wage you would pay different types of hirelings, and how the applicant will react based on things you can do to increase their reaction roll with bonus payments, signing bonuses, generosity, how to deal with refused offers. And then it's got a sidebar for another optional rule on how you would share XP and treasure with retainers. The standard rule is awarding XP. They get a full share of XP, but then they lose half of it as a retainer, so they level up slower than everybody else. Um, and then they usually get a small, you may half a share of the treasure. But here's some other ideas on how to, um, just give them their XP based on their share of the treasure, and give them a smaller share of the treasure because they're getting one as a retainer and not a full party member. Um, so again, some really kind of just fleshes out what's already there, and then gives you a couple of options. There's some quick equipment. This is a really cool thing that, again, this section is again by Gavin Norman. It's got these are default equipment packages for different types of characters. So, for example, it's got armor, weapons, and extra items. So, for say a dwarf, you roll a d6 on the armor table, and it goes everywhere from leather to leather and a shield, all the way up to plate mail and plate mail with a shield. So you roll a d6, and it tells you what your dwarf rolled 1d12 twice on the weapons table. What's interesting is the weapons table is 1 to 12, but like a thief gets to roll twice, a fighter gets to roll twice. Um, but like an acrobat, which is something they've brought in from old school advanced, you roll 1d4 twice, so you're going to be limited to these smaller weapons at the beginning of the table, as opposed to being able to roll 1d12 and get a chance of getting like a sword or a spear or a heavy very weapon. Um, and then they've got specific for acrobats, bards, clerics, druids, and knights. Actually, they've got separate tables. I'm mistaken. You don't roll a d4 on the d12 table. You roll a d4 on the acrobat table. I'm really not reading this very clearly tonight, am I? And then they notice an extra item that some characters might have, and that's basically Thieves' Tool for a thief and Holy Symbols for divine spellcasters, except for a druid who gets a sprig of mistletoe. But again, it's a really good way to randomly do equipment for. It says all characters have a backpack, a tinderbox, 1d6 torches, a water skin, 1d6 iron rations, and 3d6 gold pieces. And then you roll on these tables to get out their starting gear. And then finally, what we get in here, we get some new monsters that are themed around the concept of a snake cult. So some newly created monsters. that you can drop in anywhere you want. Some of them are kind of reminiscent of Yuan-Ti. Some of them are more unique to I guess Gavin Norman's administration here. And then you've got an adventure, the Tomb of Parath, where you can use these snake-themed monsters. This is a level 3 to 5 dungeon adventure, and it's laid out as a nice little adventure. So, and then what else do we have here? We've got a section on energy weapons. So in the last Carcass Crawler, they kind of gave us a kineticist class that you could use it to kind of make a monk, but you could also use it to kind of make a Jedi type character. So here's some options to bring in a little more sci-fi again with energy weapons, ion daggers, ion weapons, plasma weapons, and laser weapons. Dagger, staff, swords, pistols, carbides, rifles of each kind. And then electric cells and fusion cells to charge these weapons, which basically take the place of ammo. An electric cell, it gives you 15 charges. A fusion cell gives you 30 charges. And they have a rare item called a void cell, which basically, I think, powers the energy weapon indefinitely. So one of the things you have to do with these energy weapons is keep them charged up. Energy blades follow the standard class weapon restrictions. Energy weapons are designed for use in melee, consistent, 3 types of weapons: blades, stabs, and daggers, swords. Press a switch to turn it on, turn it off. And then the guns, non-martial classes can use pistols. Semi-martial classes can use pistols and carbides, but not rifles, and martial classes can use all types of guns. The DM will have to decide if clerics are able to use any of these types of weapons or not, or any other class that might have restrictions on the type of weapons they're supposed to use. So pretty cool. And they got a little more description of like what the difference between a pistol, a carbide, and a rifle is, from a sci-fi standpoint, and the different types of energy. Ion which is a stream of charged particles. Plasma, which is particles heated to extreme temperatures, and then a laser, which is focused light energy. Cool. And then they add another specialist in the one where they added black powder weapons in the previous issue. They added a type of specialist, the NPC specialist, which was a gunsmith. Now they've got an energy weapon technician as a type of specialist where you can probably maybe buy, sell, and have weapons maintained. And then we've got a section on item-based encumbrance, where you just have a number of slots. And rather than tracking weight, this reminds me a little bit, although it's not as complicated as the way Lamentations of the Flame Princess does it. So instead of tracking weight in coins, you're just going to track significant items carried. The interesting thing is that an item is classified as equipped or packed. Equipped items is anything you're holding, actively using, or you have ready access to on short notice. Armor, shields, weapons that are held or sheathed, where you can grab them on the belt, or arrows out of a quiver or something like that. Packed items are equipment that are really deep into pockets, sacks, backpacks, or containers, and you have to take a minute you have to take some effort to retrieve them. It takes a round. So to get something that's packed in your inventory, you're gonna have to. That's all you can do for the round. You don't track the encumbrance of ammunition. One-end weapons count as one item. Two-endeds count as two items. Shields count as one item. Light armor, such as leather, counts as one. Heavier armor counts as two. The item weights of standard adventuring gear are listed in. They've got a little table over here. And then treasure up to 100 coins counts as one item. Jewelry do not count as for anything unless it's a really large piece, and then it might count as one item, like a crown or something like that. Magic items count as one item, except for magic staves, they count as two. and it's got some how this would affect movement rate if you were to use this. So an example, Morgan the fighter has the following gear: 6 equipped items: chainmail, a shield, a sword. So chainmail counts as 2 items. The shield and sword count as 1 item, and a short bow counts as 2 items. But that includes a quiver and arrows for with no additional thing. 4 packed items: a rope, which is 1 item; a tinderbox is 1 item; 3 iron rations, which are a bundle that counts as 1 item; and a water skin is 1 item. Looking at the encumbrance table, she has 6 equipped items, so her puts her at a movement rate of 60 or 20 with an encounter as an encounter rate, and she has 4 packed items. So you look at the what happens is you look at the it's determined by the number of items carried. A character's equipped and packed items should both be looked up at the table, and the slower movement rate is used. So you don't pile them on top of each other. You just look at, what are your packed items? If you're only carrying those packed items, what's your rate going to be? Only factoring in your equipped items, what's your rate going to be? And you just pick the slower of the 2 movement rates. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty easy. It's a pretty simple, straightforward way of doing things. Of course, we're waiting on an expanded equipment list, which is supposed to come out in a Carcass Crawler 3. They printed it in the issue 0 that you got if you got in on early Kickstarter. This has since been hard to come by because they're going to slowly reprint all the content in these more widely distributed or widely available issues. So that expanded list is coming up in issue number 3. I hope they'll give us item-based encumbrance suggestions for any of those items along with their coin weight. And the last thing in this issue of Carcass Crawler is adjudicating traps. So the role of traps in the game is a risk-resource trade-off, a challenge to exploration. Rolling dice. Old School Essential provides rules for rolling dice to find or remove traps. All characters can search for room traps, but thieves have a special ability that allow them to remove treasure traps. Rolling dice to search for traps can be resolved very quickly. They just inform the referee that they're going to spend a turn searching an area. The referee marks advancement on time, rolls the dice, and also rolls for a wandering monster check if applicable. The cons of doing it this way is the chance of finding traps by rolling dice tends to be low because it's, for most characters, a 1 in 6. Low-level thieves are likely to have a very low chance of finding treasure traps. So the party that relies on just rolling and searching might be in for a bad time. There's also no rules for disarming room traps. That's just only bypassed or disabled by narrative interaction, where the party kind of you have to say, here's this trap. How do you guys want to try to debug it? Because it's not really a thief ability. Remember, the thief's ability is really supposed to be about, traps on treasure chests and doorknobs and things like that. Not really about pit traps and the kind of pressure plates and things like that. So players may the narrative interaction. Players can kind of bypass or disable traps by just thinking about trying to deduce what the way the trap works and thinking of a way to spring it without anybody getting hurt, or to neutralize it, or to find a reliable way around it. Handling traps with narrative interaction is often very effective, but he notes that detailed narrative interaction with the dungeon environment can be very time consuming, as players are kind of playing 20 questions with the DM and having to do experiments to see what works. The referee has to judge how much time passes when you use such methods. And here's some ideas for making traps fun. Planting clues or telegraphing so that players have a chance to kind of know, if there's a poison gas trap or an acid trap, maybe they notice a chemical odor. If there's some kind of scythe trap, maybe bisected skeleton laying on the floor, or some kind of marking that notes the passage of a heavy blade has made an impact. Traps by default, they trigger on a 1 or 2 on a 6-sided die. Optionally, the trap fails to spring. The referee may give players a clue to its presence. For example, they might hear the click, even though maybe the trap is old and rusty, and so they technically they stepped on it. It didn't go off, but they they were now aware that it's there. Vermicelitude. Another way to give player hints is where to search for traps instead of avoiding the we search every square approach, is to place them in locations that make sense given the layout and inhabitants of the dungeon. So doors to treasure vaults are important tombs are naturally going to be guarded with traps. Monsters are unlikely to place traps in corridors that they're going to frequently traverse. If this approach is used consistently in appropriate dungeons, clever players can gain knowledge of traps in advance by charming monsters, interrogating captured dungeon denizens, and so forth. Not all traps need to be lethal. Traps that cause interesting problems, such as they're trapped in a net, it takes them several rounds to get out. Or the trap, it may be a magical trap, transports characters to another part of the dungeon, and they get disoriented and have to find their way back. And he ends it with a section called Savoring Character Death. Finally, it's important to note that character death is an intrinsic part of old school play, especially at lower levels, and players are advised to learn and enjoy the tragic, gruesome, and comedic deaths of their characters. And that's it for Carcass Crawler number 3, or issue number 2. I'm sorry. I think the one thing I will immediately put into the game is just these town services as a reference. And just because people need to know how much it costs to get a pint of ale or a meal. Those are probably the things I'll most immediately implement. And then I might, if we start a new campaign, might be tempted to use the item-based encumbrance. But I really like, and like I said, the wood elf as an option for player characters. But that's Carcass Crawler number 2. And that'll just about do it for this episode. This is kind of a long one, but I want to thank everybody for listening. Thanks again to Joe Richter of Hindsightless for his call that we had to start the show off. And appreciate everybody out there, wherever you're listening from in the world. I hope you're doing well. Take care of yourself, and I'll be back with another episode sooner or later. Bye now. Thanks for listening to the Arcane Alienist podcast. The music you're hearing is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. The cover art I use for the episodes is by Dave Bone. Be sure and check out his website, ironseer.com, for a lot of other great gaming-related content. You can always leave me a voice message through the Anchor app or at the Anchor website, or you can email me at arcane.alienist@gmail.com. Once again, I appreciate you listening. Thanks so much.